Hey, we are live. Now all we have to do is tell people about it.
All right. Well, hold on. I'll go tell a few people.
Tell your wife. She can tune in from the other room. I am just checking our pages, our YouTube and Facebook pages. We are live on videos. There it is.
Uh-huh.
I'm going to make sure all of our I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere Facebook fans are tuned into this particular link. We'll give them the direct link. And we'll keep an eye on those pages for comments as we go through this. This is a bit of an experiment. We haven't done this before. Usually we just deal in audio. And this is a bit of a different approach for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. We also have a bit of a video delay in Facebook and YouTube. So if we don't respond to questions the direct right away, that is part of the problem. And we'll keep an eye.
I don't know what you mean when you say delay.
Very funny. Mike McClure, Mark Jones, John Sherwood, Helena Hurd. Good to see you all. If we don't shout out to everyone, please, you have our abject apologies, but we're dealing with a delay, and Facebook and YouTube don't necessarily tell us how this all works in real time. So apologies for that. We'll see if things are going smashingly on YouTube as well.
What you don't know is that this is really only being transmitted to Mark Zuckerberg's shoe closet. And the rest of Facebook, is just writing new conspiracy theories.
That's a full-time gig for some people.
It is. I blame Moriarty myself.
Well, we are, I'm going to shoot a link out on Twitter as well, just so we make sure people are joining us here. As you all assemble, welcome. Glad to see you here.
Yeah, there are a couple of things I would point out. First, it's almost 15 minutes past the hour, so Trifles is right on schedule.
Well, we're just a trifle late.
Yes.
You see how that works?
Yes.
And
this is exactly how we do the show, except for the fact that Scott is wearing pants today. Why don't you scroll down and let's...
That's okay. That's...
Oh, my God. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say anything.
Oh.
And it's this sort of connected conversation that we know you've prized when you listen to Trifles, particularly by hitting that ×2 button on your iPad. That's why we always sound like this.
Got a message on Facebook Messenger, because we don't have enough channels to track already, from Steve Mason. Who says, Bert, you look a little orange.
Yeah, I know. I was spent the weekend at Mar-a-Lago, and that's what happens to me.
Everybody gets an automatic bronzer tan as they walk through the entrance there.
Oh, it's my lights here. My natural glow.
Well, thank you, folks, for joining us. For some reason, I'm not seeing the live video on YouTube right now. I'm trying to monitor that. I don't see it coming out. Oh, dear. Having to talk and chew gum at the same time. Apologies. We are... this is where I'm doing all of the technical work, and Bert is just sitting there looking great.
Works for me. Boy, I love division of labor.
Hey, it's a hard job, but somebody's got to do it, right?
The proletariat needs to control the means of production. And so that's why we've handed those means of production off to Scott Monty. I guess your Indeed post for a producer wasn't responded to, I suppose.
I guess not.
No.
Well, I don't know why. Goodness gracious, why we're not live on YouTube.
Me neither.
I'm looking to see if I can affect that. We do have a few folks asking over there.
Okay, folks. Well, while that happens, I'll read to you from the Lapham's Quarterly edition on happiness. Let's open it at random. Oh, Dennis Diderot. No, that's not going to work. Blaise Pascal. No, sorry. Satisfaction in New Haven, Connecticut.
Writing a note to our YouTube watchers right now.
Many of our priorities around happiness are completely erroneous. For a lot of students, that's almost too much to bear. After all, students today are likely to have shaped their entire lives around a set of preconceptions that have brought them to one of the premier Ivy League colleges in America, and presumably set them up for a lifetime of success. And yet, they feel currently unhappy. Not like me.
Okay. Well, I can't seem to make this work. We're using, just so folks at home know, we're using a service called StreamYard that allows us to coordinate the video here and then shoot it out to our other properties. But for some reason, it doesn't look like it is. Oh, let me see. It says view on YouTube. What an amazing what an amazing hint there. View on YouTube. What an amazing. There it is. Wow, I got the echo in my ear. Now, let me let our YouTube fans know. Oh boy.
Yep. Luckily, they've come in here at the end of the show.
Okay, hopefully this will work. And I'll also let them know on Twitter what our YouTube link is. Folks, thank you. If you're just tuning in, if you're just joining us here, thank you so much for being part of this. We're glad you're here, and we do appreciate your patience. If anything, the entertainment value here is watching a couple of dolts like Bert and I, who are usually fairly technologically savvy, struggle with live streaming our show. You can tell this is why we operate in audio and why we also operate in an edited fashion, because you don't need to watch or see this kind of thing normally.
Look away.
Hey, look away, look away.
Small children, tell them to look away.
Okay, there's the YouTube link, and here is the Facebook link, just for good measure.
Well, Scott, I think at this point in the program, we should ask people if they have any questions.
Yeah, why are they here? That's they're asking themselves now.
These friends, this is 20 minutes of your life you're never going to get back.
Indeed, indeed. Well, we have 50 visitors now, 50 viewers, and we're going to officially kick things off. So
wait a minute, are they standing 6 feet apart?
I don't know.
If you have 50 visitors, each standing 6 feet apart,
I can't.
And all of them queue for toilet paper. The question I have is, what happened to the chicken? That's the question I have.
It crossed the road. It crossed the road. We gotta cross our I's and dot our T's here. So let's get started with this episode of Trifles, which is, well, let's start it the official way. This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were men that were dancing, creeping, and crooked, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? What's a tantalus? Or a gasogene? And what's the difference between a hansom cab and a four-wheeler?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 169, Loneliness and Isolation in the Canon. Hello and welcome once again to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast, where we look into some of the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
And I'm Burt Wolder.
And we are delighted to be with you here today. We are recording this episode, of course, but we're also broadcasting it live on YouTube and Facebook. Our first time ever for trying this. And the reason we're doing this is because it has become apparent that many people are sheltering in place because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there are cases where people can become quite lonely, isolated, and perhaps even depressed. And we thought we might run this little show just to interrupt your day for a bit and to provide a little entertainment and to keep us all connected. So that's why we are here. If you are listening to this as a recording, you can find the show notes at ihose.co/trifles169. And of course, you can follow us on social media on YouTube, now Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, where we are I Hear of Sherlock. And if you have it in your hearts, if you'd like to help support the show, you can go to our Patreon page, which you can reach off of SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Find us on Patreon there and donate. $1 a month is as little as it costs, or you can give whatever you want. But all of your donations go directly to supporting the show here. We have costs like streaming. We've paid for the branding now on StreamYard, so you see this neato banner coming up, and it allows us to distribute the show to folks. So anything that you can give would help. Just go to our homepage, SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. and make that donation. We will be taking questions from you. We'll be taking questions and comments in the second half of the show, but Burt and I wanted to kick it off right now by beginning the discussion about who are some of the people in the Sherlock Holmes stories that we come across who happen to be lonely or isolated in some way. And Burt, because I'm in a giving spirit, I thought, well, I'd allow you to start the conversation here. Who are some of the lonely people that we know in the Sherlock Holmes stories, and why are they lonely?
Well, that's a terrific question for which I don't have a terribly detailed answer. I mean, when I think about loneliness in the Sherlock Holmes stories, the first person I think about is Sherlock Holmes, who we will find eventually. This is one of the few things that I looked up earlier. In The Lion's Mane, we do have a reference to Holmes in retirement in supposedly his own words. And after a couple of paragraphs where he describes his villa and so on, he says, interestingly enough, he says, my house is lonely. But that's kind of it. I mean, and when you look at what goes on in The Lion's Mane, you find that there's, even in the far reaches of Holmes's retirement, there's no shortage of people popping around the neighborhood, and he has his housekeeper. But Holmes is someone who, I don't know, when I think about Holmes, I think he may have had congenital loneliness because he wasn't the easiest person to be around. And so we know how he amuses himself, because there are lots of points in the canon where he and Watson we've talked about this over the last few episodes, because of the weather, they're stuck in the house. So he has his chemical table. And our pal Chris Zordan has written, I think, about what kind of experiments Holmes might have had.
Bert,
Oh,
can
and
we get your volume up a little bit?
get my
Folks are
volume.
having trouble hearing you.
Oh, really? Okay. How's that?
Oh, much better.
Okay. So Holmes has his chemical table, and we know that he does experiments of a wide variety. And Chris Sorden's written about that. He's also does things like explore the motets of Lassus. He engages in target practice. He sometimes takes cocaine. He updates his indexes. He reads. We don't know a lot about what he reads, but he's familiar with Horace and Hafiz and Winwood Reade. And music. He amuses himself with his violin and on the phonograph and so on. So there's a start, Sherlock Holmes.
I think that's a great start. There's another section, and he's not yet retired yet, in The Adventure of the Mazarin Stone, where, of course, this is that famous narration, that third-party narration. It was pleasant to Dr. Watson to find himself once more in the untidy room of the first floor of Baker Street, which had been the starting point of so many remarkable adventures. He looked round him at the scientific charts upon the wall, the acid-charred bench of chemicals, the violin case leaning in the corner, the coal scuttle which contained of old the pipes and tobacco. Finally, his eyes came round to the fresh and smiling face of Billy, the young but very wise and tactful page who had helped fill up the gap of loneliness and isolation which surrounded the saturnine figure of the great detective. So we remember when Holmes is reminiscing in one of his cases about Watson leaving him for a wife, the only selfish thing that he remembered. This could have very well been the case that Holmes knew. He told us in A Study in Scarlet that he got into fits of great depression from time to time. So Holmes probably knew that he was subject to this type of loneliness and isolation, and did appear to prefer having people around him, if for nothing more than to validate his thoughts, to whom he could show off in some cases, and use them as an outlet for his intellectual pursuits. Remember, he always said that his mind was like a racing engine. If it's not hooked up to the work with which it's supposed to be doing, it will crack itself to pieces. And having a companion there, someone to share his thoughts, to share his intuition with, was one way to do that.
Absolutely. Although I find it hard to believe that Holmes ever turned to Billy and said, Billy, if this solution turns blue, it means a man's life.
And Billy would go, "Oh, I'll get the door, sir."
Billy would go, "You talking to me?" Right.
That's great. Yeah.
Well, that's true. And then there's Watson. We know Watson describes himself early on as not the most sociable person in the world, and finds himself when he comes to London without a friend. And that's why Mike Dirda and other people have called the cases of Sherlock Holmes as the stories of the world's first consulting detective and his only friend. But we know that when Watson has some time on his hands, he reads yellowback novels and the sea stories of whoever that writer, Clark Russell, and goes and plays billiards with Thurston at least once. So he's a little bit more sociable. But this whole question about loneliness in the canon, we do see some other evidences of it. I mean, we hadn't talked about this, but when I think of loneliness in the canon, I think about people like Nathan Garadeb.
Oh.
And Garadeb, now clearly here's somebody who is so in his own circle or in his own process or whatever's going on with Nathan Garadeb that he rarely gets out of the house, which is one of the reasons why his presence at home becomes an issue. But he has, like many Victorians, this collection. He's collected, Holmes says, something like old bones and all kinds of stuff, lots of stuff but nothing of particular value, has his little cabinet of curiosities. And that's a characteristic, I think, of certainly English society at a certain point. I mean, when you go to Britain and walk around, you'll eventually bump into Sloane Square. And Sloane Square, is named after Hans Sloane, who was the founder of the British Museum. And it was Sloane who, I guess in the 17th century, was beavering around cataloging plants and animals and things. And, in the same way, what's his name? Ashmole. How the library at Oxford, the Ashmolean, is named after another 17th century fellow who was busy cataloging things, although I think Ashmole collected manuscripts and so on. So collecting, cataloging, natural history, this is very much aligned with Holmes, who was a great observer of what we like to call trifles, but of course, natural science in a way, evidence and things. So this is part of amusing yourself by cataloging the world is sort of a characteristic of people.
Yeah, that's just it. I think it's important for all of us to have some kind of hobby, some kind of outlet through which we can either share with others, much like we do here, or simply take some time in isolation and enjoy ourselves. And the thing there is, there's a bit of a dichotomy there. I think yes, you can immerse yourself in that kind of study and in whatever it is that you're passionate about, but at the same time, being immersed in that kind of a bubble, being so isolated from the rest of society or from great swaths of society, can build misinformation. It can build gullibility in some cases if you don't know exactly what to expect. That's a great example of even Jabez Wilson, much like Nathan Garadeb. He was busy running a shop, right? He was there isolated in his shop day to day, and of course customers would come in. But when someone came in with this fanciful tale that, there was a lottery basically, and Jabez Wilson was the winner, well, of course he'd be predisposed to want to believe that. Day after day, opening his shop and maybe selling a couple of things. That kind of isolation can build, again, misinformation. And I think staying in touch with each other in this particular time, as we are, and you can do it via video, you can do it via letter writing. I think there's going to be a whole swath of letter writing that comes back to us. And I do want to get to letter writing with respect to isolation, because that leads us directly into the red circle.
Well, right.
You think about Amelia Luca, who was shut up in Mrs. Warren's boarding house there for personal safety, certainly. And the only way she had to communicate with Mrs. Warren was by writing a word down. One at a time, she would leave a word on her tray. So this is a woman who was isolated by, she was physically isolated, but she was also isolated by virtue of the language. She spoke only Italian or very poor English, and was using words that she could find in the newspaper to help satisfy her wants.
It's a great example. Loneliness really was the common characteristic of life. I recall years ago living in a little town, getting to know my neighbors who were older, much older, and realized in conversation with them that they had never been anywhere beyond sort of a 50-mile radius of where they lived. And it's not everybody who's like Shakespeare, and who goes from Stratford to London. There are people who just keep in their own particular orbit. But thankfully, all that is gone now that we have the internet, Facebook, and social media.
And here we are. Well,
yes.
Let's use this opportunity to take a quick word from our sponsor. And when we come back, we'll get to some of your comments and questions that we see popping up in our Facebook page. So stay tuned.
Are we dropping a spot in here, or should...
It is always a pleasure to receive the Baker Street Journal in the mail. It comes not 4, but 5 times a year. Your 4 seasonal quarterlies plus the Christmas annual. and each time it is a welcome sight. That envelope arriving, tearing it open, seeing the yellow-backed cover, and the cover art in recent years has been changing each time. The publishers are keeping us on our toes. And of course, the content inside is no less exciting. You don't get too much on repeat with the Baker Street Journal, although you will see responses to various articles by other authors. But it is a lovely way to stay in touch with the Sherlockian world and to understand the things that are on people's minds and the things that are worth discussing. Check it out at bakerstreetirregulars.com and make sure you subscribe today.
Okay. Always nice to hear from our friends at the Baker Street Journal. We are back and we are ready to discuss some of your comments and questions. They have been flowing in, so I do appreciate that. We've got folks who are introverts and extroverts, and I think this very rightly kind of shows the divide with how people decide to handle their individual situations, whether they're in the canon or not. But another woman who comes up who was very lonely, and I lost who mentioned this to us, is Eugenia Ronder. This, of course, comes to us from The Veiled Lodger, one of the later cases, but it's probably the ultimate story in loneliness. This is a woman who self-isolated after she was horribly injured and disfigured by a circus accident. We won't give too much away. And Holmes went to talk with her. And in some ways, her case was not necessarily the solving of a mystery, although it was determining who she was and why she was veiled. That was what we were after in that story, in as much as it was a confessional of sorts. You know, we've talked about this on a number of shows before, that so many of the characters in the canon are tragic figures. They have incredibly sad stories or questionable endings. We don't know how life goes on after them. It's not always a happy ending, but for the reader's perspective, it makes great sense because it's a definite conclusion to what we were looking for. And with Eugenia Ronder, here is a woman who decided to self-isolate after those many years, and in fact was questioning her worth on this earth. And Holmes reminded her at the very end that her life is not her own, and that if she were ever tempted to take it, that she should approach him for assistance.
Yeah, it's a very good example. Yeah, lonely. I mean, you know, there are so many negative. I don't know how many. Well, I guess there are a great number of tragic figures in the canon. That's true. We have talked about that. But loneliness, you know, has a profoundly negative set of characteristics. I think of Violet Hunter, you know, who goes back to her flat after this poor interview at Westerways and sees the bills that are due and realizes that she's sort of at the end of her tether. So, yeah, that is. And these sorts of desperate moments do characterize lots of people who have worked themselves into nervous apoplexy or other things, you know, before they consult Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I lost, apologies. I lost who exactly said this because the comments they're getting squished down here for me. But someone mentioned that Holmes himself was isolated or nearly isolated for 3 years during the Great Hiatus. You know, he immediately fled after the interaction with Professor Moriarty at the Reichenbach Falls. A week later, he found himself in Florence, and over the next 3 years, he went all the way to Tibet, and then through Mecca, and eventually back through France, and made his way to London. So in doing so, he could not have had companionship of any meaningful sort, even though he may have spent time with the Lama, 1L, not 2, remember that. He was traveling alone and had to maintain his disguise Of course, he was known as Sigerson during the time,
Mm.
rather than really give away his secret to many folks.
Yep. Yeah, that was Bob Katz, who I think I'm not really seeing all of the comments coming in, but I did see, this one from Bob Katz, who pointed out that Lindsay, our friend Lindsay Fay, wrote about this in her essay in the manuscript series.
Yeah, I'm just grabbing it off the shelf right now.
Uh-huh.
Folks watching live can see me. You can't see this if you're on video. I just grabbed Out of the Abyss from our friends at the BSI Press.
Oh.
Not our advertiser this time around, but they do make their way to us from time to time. And Lindsay Fay wrote an essay called An Empty House on page 157 here. It's been a while since I've read this. And Bob, thank you for bringing that back to our attention. And the way Lindsay wrote this was as an excerpt from the diary of Dr. Watson in early 1894. And again, Watson himself mentions when Holmes comes back that he was suffering from his own great bereavement. And we're meant to infer that that means the loss of his wife, who, of course, would have been Mary Morstan at the time, Mary Morstan Watson. So Watson himself would have been enduring a certain kind of loneliness and isolation, having gone from having a fairly steady roommate / companion from 1881 on, and then, of course, leaving Holmes for marriage, and then losing his next companion. So, of course, we can understand that Watson, who himself was lonely when he got back from India in A Study in Scarlet, of course, looking for companionship at that point. So I think, we started by mentioning the loneliness of Sherlock Holmes, but Watson himself was not a stranger to isolation and loneliness.
Yes, absolutely. And there are, it's now that I think about this, you really find it's difficult to open up the canon and look at a character that doesn't have some connection to loneliness and isolation. And I just opened up a book, and what did I see? I saw the 5 Orange Pips. So there you've got a bunch of Openshaws who are, let's put it this way, their lives are disrupted when they get envelopes of orange pips because they're being pursued. And then, of course, you've got the Sholtos and the people who've committed crimes and who are worried about discovery. And, there are very few people who, in the canon, who've created a new identity for themselves who don't later on have some difficulty about it.
Yeah. I want to turn to a couple of medical cases, or one medical case and one, I guess we could call it a medical case because it's probably more psychological in nature, of isolation and quarantine. Mary Alcaro mentions poor Godfrey Emsworth, who, of course, was in The Blanched Soldier, only in quarantine, right? That was an actual quarantine in the canon. We mentioned infectious diseases a few episodes ago. Well, this is right in line with that. And Claire Thomas mentions the resident patient, who she thinks was lonely with only his paranoia and money for company. I think that's another great one. Can you imagine living, 20 years beyond your crime and not being able to share with anyone exactly who you were or why you were afraid? And of course, that's exactly why he invited Dr. Percy Trevelyan to join him as his resident physician, as he himself was the resident patient.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we could go on, and maybe we should make this some kind of a regular thing here on Trifles, notwithstanding all of our technical challenges. What we're going to do now is we're going to close the official show that will go into the recording can, but we'll remain here on video to continue to chat with you guys and take some questions and feedback. So if anything, this has not been A trifle.
So smooth, so problem-free.
Almost there. Hang on.
Squeak.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You take my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Okay, and then you will have to tune in to our official show to hear exactly which Granada clip we choose to close with. There's a different clip every week, and it's our little Easter egg, our little surprise to you from time to time. So that is the official end of the recorded version, and we'll keep chatting here because we've got lots of comments to get to, and I do want to get over to YouTube as well. So Jim, your question, can this be saved? Yes, it will automatically archive into a recorded video, which you can pick up on the iHose Facebook page or on our YouTube channel at any time. And just skip past the first few minutes of where we're trying to get ourselves in order here. That should handle everything. And Bert, if you want to scroll through the comments there and answer more questions while I find our YouTube channel to see if folks are lined up there, we can do that.
Oh yeah. Hey, what nice nice comments from people. I wasn't seeing them. Oh, but so many lovely ones like my feed is freezing up. I like that. During that cold snap in London when Holmes and Watson were stuck in the house, I think Watson said something similar about something freezing up. Maybe it was his toes. But what a bunch of good comments here. Homeschooling. Now, see, that's something I never thought about. We don't have any. Well, of course, we have in the Copper Beaches, Violet Hunter, who has to care for that objectionable child for a while. But we don't have. Well, of course, we do too. In
Oh yeah.
Objectionable child. Yeah, thing.
Or rich.
Yeah.
Rich. Yeah.
Yeah. Governesses and things like that.
Yeah.
Homeschooling. That is interesting. Can Bert turn up the volume?
Yeah, we got that already.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Really, this was a good idea.
Well, it was a lot of fun, and I feel we've got people who are following along there and posting. I see Rob Nunn posted a selfie with us on the laptop in the background. That was awesome, and I love the pink headphones, Rob. It's a good touch.
Lady Francis. Now, here's a lovely comment. I thought about that from Sandy about Lady Francis Carfax. And there is that wonderful line where Holmes is so eloquent. Of course, we know Conan Doyle had sisters who were governesses. He clearly thought a lot about it, but we've got that wonderful line where he describes people who are moving from pension to pension, women at large like chickens in a sea of foxes and things like that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's another great one. I had a couple of others listed here, or one other. Beryl Stapleton. It's not necessarily referenced directly in the canon, but you can imagine that someone in such a lonely and isolated place. And Watson did mention Dartmoor when it came to loneliness. That was the other mention in the canon. He said, the sun was already sinking when I reached the summit of the hill, and the long slopes behind me were all golden green on one side and gray shadow on the other. A haze lay low upon the farthest skyline, out of which jutted the fantastic shapes of Belliver and Vixen Tor. Over the wide expanse there was no sound and no movement. One great gray bird, a gull or curlew, soared aloft in the blue heaven. He and I seemed to be the only living things between the huge arch of the sky and the desert beneath it. The barren scene, the sense of loneliness, and the mystery and urgency of my task all struck a chill into my heart. And you can imagine that living in such an environment as Beryl Stapleton did, again, someone who was isolated by virtue of necessity, and whose husband slash brother took great pains to keep her from the rest of society, and certainly was disturbed when she and Henry began to take up together. You can imagine the extreme sense of boredom, loneliness, and terror that went through her own mind.
Yeah, it's a very good example. Very good example. I'm also, struck by one of Corey Howell's remarks about the exchange between Holmes and Watson at the end of Sign of Four, where, Watson says to him, well, you look weary. And Holmes says, yeah, I'm going to be as limp as a rag for a week. And then Watson says, this is a poor division of labor. I get a wife out of it and this, that, and the other thing. And then the last line is, for me, there was always the cocaine bottle. And then he reaches up his long white hand.
That's amazing. Yeah.
That's sad.
Some other recent comments that came in here and related to The Hound of the Baskervilles. Bob Katz says he always thought of Laura Lyons as a desperately lonely person. Yeah. Again, someone who had a failing marriage, who was seeking maybe friendship, some kind of solace with Sir Charles. And, when Holmes and Watson were able to track her, I think they got a sense of that loneliness as well.
Yes.
Claire Thomas mentions in The Copper Beeches on the Train, doesn't Holmes call the farmsteads lonely little dwellings?
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Holmes mentions seeing, or at least being able to believe, that there's more evil in these isolated places than there even is in the city, because people can get away with more things due to that sense of isolation.
Yeah, and then Bob Katz observed he always thought of Laurel. Did we talk about this? Always thought about.
I just said that.
You did mention.
Are you multitasking again, Bert?
No, I'm just not paying any attention. I find these shows go a lot better if I don't pay attention.
I know. Well, like most of our listeners, that's good. Yeah. I'm glad you're in league with them.
Yeah.
But
Steve, I did pay enough attention to know it sounded familiar.
That's amazing. Steve Mason just said, how about John Ferrier in Scarlet? Yeah. I mean, that's the ultimate isolation. Everyone's been killed by disease, starvation, or, vulture. And it's just he and little Lucy at that point. And each of them, both Lucy and John Ferrier, were probably dealing with their own bouts of loneliness in the, day or days or so that led up to them meeting each other.
Well, loneliness is not, sometimes loneliness is not all it's cracked up to be. We've mentioned Godfrey Emsworth a couple of times. And every time I see the name Godfrey Emsworth, I always think of Lord Emsworth, who is one of P.G. Woodhouse's characters in Blandings, who has except for his sister, has a lovely life, a pig, books, regular whiskey deliveries, is having a great time in the country.
That sounds like something we should all be doing right about now.
Yeah. You say to Lord Emsworth, you've got to go to London, my lord. He says, London, my God, why would I want to do that? Why would I want to leave my home? And that's the great thing about being a Sherlockian. Well, I guess, or could be, at least somebody who's surrounded by lots of books. There's no shortage of things for us to do.
Yeah. Well, and I love seeing the books behind you, as I love showcasing my own here. Perhaps we will do a another episode, not a recorded episode, and maybe it's again not branded with Trifles, but could be I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere in general, where we do a show and tell. Bring your favorite item, and perhaps we can even use some other kind of technology, whether it's Zoom or something else, to invite people in and show off their own books, collections, etc. It could be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
We'd love to hear some feedback. If folks want to leave some feedback here in the comment section, feel free to do that. Or if you'd like to leave us a comment, just email us at comment@ihearofsherlock.com.
Yeah. Excellent.
That is great. Will you look here?
Where?
There is a special comments button right here in our interface on StreamYard where we can see all this stuff from both platforms. Oh boy.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Well, I'm seeing it.
This.
Yeah, I'm seeing it on the live comment stream from StreamYard, which is pretty good.
Yeah, this is great.
Here's an interesting comment. Reuben Marsden had too about Robert Downey's Sherlock Holmes, that he's very lonely. Yeah, but deservedly so, because Robert Downey's Sherlock Holmes is particularly odd, I think.
Yeah. Eric Deckers, I don't want to let this comment go without mention, but he said, I never knew Bert had a mustache. Yeah.
Me neither.
Anyone else think Scott should grow a mustache? Nope, no one. No one does.
No, I should have put a bow tie on, though. Next time, I'll put one of my Sherlockian bow ties on.
We'll do a rotation. This is the Holmes bow tie, if I may. There we can see that. This is from our friends at Bow Ties Limited of Vermont. You get in front of the camera.
And they will eventually be marketing that, I think.
Yes, they will.
God bless them.
Indeed. A lot of fun for all kinds of folks. Here we are. New comments. Sorry. And apologies if we haven't gotten to everyone. So, Jennifer, good to see you. Claire, glad you were with us. Reuben, extrovert that you are, I'm glad we could kind of fill that void. Bob asks, how are Sherlockians coping with this isolation? Bob, that's a great question. I think this is one way that we're helping to cope with that. The springtime has naturally been a time when a lot of Sherlockian societies come out of hibernation, and many of them, if not all of them, have had to cancel their spring events, either proactively or retroactively, or reactively to what's going on. And I thought, well, maybe we can do something with regularity here that allows people to recreate a sense of what goes on at some of those. Perhaps we can have some regular talks and papers that are given. My preference is a talk where someone can speak authoritatively on a subject rather than sit here and read to you. Of course, if you're a very good reader and it doesn't sound like you're reading, that might also be something worth pursuing as well. But the idea of having a virtual Sherlockian Scion meeting to me sounded like one way that we could help deal with some of this isolation. So stay tuned on that.
Yes, I like that.
Steve Mason responded. He says, Bob, I'm reworking my collection of autographs. If you've never seen Steve Mason's collection of Sherlockian autographs, it's actors who have portrayed I don't think it's just Holmes. I think it may be Holmes and Watson as well. And Steve, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here. But maybe we can get you to send in some photographs, Steve, and we can do a blog post on ihearofsherlock.com where we can showcase your collection and share it with people. I think that would be a wonderful way to get the word out there and for other people to share some of your joy.
Yeah. Virtual, and we get a lot of good feedback. Thank you, Bob, about virtual Scion meetings. It's an awful thing to be looking forward to meetings of the Sons of the Copper Beeches and the Speckled Band and others, and and find that that's not part of the year anymore, and Ash Wednesday and things like that. So filling that void would be a good thing.
Yeah. Over on YouTube, Chris Cross asks, would you say that Paul Cratitas from The Greek Interpreter was isolated, even though he was among his kidnappers? Absolutely. I think that's another example, just like Emilia Luca, where he didn't even speak the language. They needed an interpreter to get through to him. So, of course, he was physically isolated in, the Myrtles. That was the name of the house. And he was, isolated by virtue of language.
Lots of isolation.
Absolutely. Howard Ostrom, apologies, Howard, makes the point that Selden was one of the most isolated figures, having escaped from Dartmoor and then wandering out there on the moor. Only his sister could provide him with food and clothing. And I don't think she even, we don't know whether she did that in person or left it in a bundle somewhere for him to come pick up.
No, and Patrick Ewing comments about the Hound. Now there is a character who's definitely isolated.
That's a great point.
Yes, and then there's Carlo the Mastiff in the Copper Beaches. He was pretty isolated and got pretty hungry.
The funny thing is, I saw somebody share this somewhere. They said, imagine all of the dogs at home right now getting so much more love and attention because we're home with them, working from home or schooling from home. I think dogs, like horses, as Holmes mentions in Silver Blaze, are gregarious creatures, and they thrive on that contact with humans. And so imagine how the Hound and Carlo must have gotten worked up the way they did to attack when they finally did see a human, not only out of hunger, but just out of personality at that point.
Dogs, I think, are very puzzled by the human habit of sitting still in one place for a very long time, staring at an illuminated screen. I think dogs can't figure out what's going on.
No, they can't. George Carlin years ago in one of his stand-up routines said, what do dogs do on their day off? They can't lie around. That's their job. So now there's an interesting point by Eric, who mentions, by the way, that his father got a bow tie based on our bow tie episode. So
good.
I'm glad. One sale. That's good. One sale. He says Mrs. Hudson must have been constantly alone other than greeting Holmes's visitors. Well, what do we know about that? There is a story where it's Mrs. Turner, not Mrs. Hudson. That was, of course, a scandal in Bohemia, was doing some of the helping. The speculation is that Mrs. Hudson was gone visiting somewhere. But the rest of the time, she had to provide, I don't know if it was 3 square meals a day or at least 1 to Holmes and Watson. So she very much had to be on the premises. But we don't know anything about her personal life, do we?
No, we don't even know if there was a Mr. Hudson, although I like to believe that her estranged husband was Morse Hudson, and that's just a detail Watson didn't bother us with.
Just as an aside, speaking of Morse Hudson, one of my favorite scenes in the Granada Sherlock Holmes is in The Six Napoleons, when Lestrade visits Baker Street and mentions something about, Watson mentions something about Red Republicans, and Lestrade goes, "Oh, you've been talking to Morse Hudson." And Brett immediately jumps in. Holmes jumps in with, "Oh, do go on, Lestrade." I love that little exchange there.
I didn't know Morse Hudson was a senator from Vermont. That's amazing.
Oh, Red Republican. Got it. Yeah.
It's
been a while there, Bernie. I'm not a Bernie bro. What can I say? Well, thank you all. I think Bert and I have been on for about an hour. Many of you have been with us since we finally went live. I think at about quarter past the hour. So thank you.
Only an hour, huh?
I know, right? Let's do this again. This was a lot of fun. And thank you for your feedback. Keep the feedback coming either in comments here or shoot us an email at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. Make sure your friends and all Sherlockians you know are subscribed to us. Get those email updates when we send them out. Like our page, subscribe to our YouTube channel, whatever works for you. It was delightful to see 50 or so of you at a time in here, keeping that number consistent throughout. Until next time, I'm Scott Monty.
And I'm unfortunately still Bert Wolder.
And together we say,
the game's afoot.